Hey there, and welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're going to completely flip a deeply held belief right on its head. We usually go through life just expecting that effort equals reward, that things balance out. But honestly, the universe is predictably wonky. Today, we're exploring the 80-20 principle, the absolute secret to achieving way more with a whole lot less.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Here is our roadmap for today. 1. The unbalanced universe. 2. Origins of the principle. 3. Chaos theory and imbalance. 4. Doing an 80-20 analysis. And finally, 5. The power of 80-20 thinking.
Starting off with Section 1, the unbalanced universe. We're looking at the myth of equal balance versus the reality of predictable imbalance.
So we all kind of suffer from something called the 50-50 fallacy. It's the super deeply rooted, almost democratic expectation we have that causes and results are just equally balanced. We naturally assume that 50% of our inputs are going to yield 50% of our outputs. But actually, scratch that. It is simply not true. The reality is a predictable imbalance. The 80-20 reality shows us time and time again that a tiny minority of inputs, or effort, literally leads to the vast majority of the results or rewards.
Now, what's really interesting about this is when you start to visualize that predictable imbalance. If you look at your inputs, your causes, or your effort, a really tiny portion at the bottom, just 20%, is responsible for driving a massive 80% of the resulting outputs. So for all practical purposes, 4/5 of your effort is largely irrelevant to the final outcome. Crazy, right?
If this all sounds a little bit too theoretical, let's fire off some incredibly relatable everyday examples to show just how ubiquitous this law really is. In your own home, 20% of your carpets are getting 80% of the wear. Out in society, 20% of criminals account for 80% of the value of all crime. On the road, 20% of motorists cause 80% of the accidents. It even applies to engineering. A standard internal combustion engine wastes 80% of its energy in combustion. Only 20% actually reaches the wheels. Yet that 20% generates 100% of the forward motion.
And get this, the imbalance gets even more shocking in completely unrestricted markets. A recent economic study of 300 movies found that a mere 1.3% of films earned 80% of all box office revenues. No way, right? It turns out moviegoers behave a lot like gas particles in completely random motion. Word of mouth just bounces around until a tiny fraction of movies takes almost all the profits, while the rest are left with pretty much nothing.
Moving right along to Section 2, Origins of the Principle. A century of uncovering the vital few.
So this wasn't just some overnight discovery. Back in 1897, Italian economist Vilfredo Pareto first noticed this predictable imbalance in wealth distribution. Fast forward to 1949, and Harvard professor George K. Ziff proved that resources naturally arrange themselves to minimize work, which he called the principle of least effort. That actually sparked a whole quality revolution when Joseph Juran penned the rule of the vital few in 1951 to root out industrial defects. And finally, by 1963, IBM used this exact logic to discover their computers were spending 80% of their time executing just 20% of their code. By optimizing that, they completely crushed the competition.
All right, Section 3, Chaos Theory and Imbalance. Let's talk about why the universe absolutely abhors balance. Well, it really all comes down to chaos theory. This is a scientific concept positing that there's a self-organizing logic behind disorder, where relationships are fundamentally nonlinear. Because of feedback loops, small initial influences multiply into highly unexpected results. Think of goldfish in a pond. Even if you start with goldfish of almost exactly the same size, the ones that are just slightly bigger have this tiny initial advantage, maybe stronger propulsion or a slightly larger mouth. This allows them to capture disproportionate amounts of food, and very quickly they become massively larger than the rest. It shows us that in nature and in life, initial advantages compound, meaning causes and results are almost never equal.
This predictable nonlinearity is a fundamental rule of how nature organizes itself. Economist Paul Krugman described this self-organizing logic perfectly. He called it spooky, eerie, and terrifyingly exact. The 80-20 principle isn't just a freak of chance. It's the exact, eerie math of the universe revealing itself to us.
Which brings us to Section 4, doing an 80-20 analysis. This is where we start quantifying the vital few and the trivial many.
And this brilliantly illustrates the difference. On one hand, a theoretical 50-50 profit pattern looks beautifully balanced. Half the products make half the profit. But in the real world, that is highly unusual. Instead, a typical 80-20 analysis reveals a hyper-productive reality. Just 20% of your products are likely driving a massive 80% of your profits. And this imbalance is exactly what you want to be on the lookout for.
Let's walk through a super relatable analogy to demonstrate the math here. Beer drinkers. Let's say you surveyed 100 friends about their weekly beer consumption and ranked them from highest to lowest. You could easily identify the super productive minority. You'd likely find that your top 20% of friends drink 70 to 80% of the total beer, while the bottom 80% drink only a tiny, tiny fraction. When you actually plot this out as a frequency distribution, the data reveals this massive, steep curve for those top 20 drinkers, before completely flattening out for the casual majority. Now, if you're a brewery, the practical application here is a total game changer. You could save massive time and money by pretty much ignoring the casual drinkers and focusing your promotion strictly on that vital 20%.
Finally, Section 5, the power of 80-20 thinking. Let's look at applying this mindset to everyday life.
So applying this principle actually takes two distinct forms. First, there's the 80-20 analysis, which requires rigorous data collection. It's quantitative and highly precise. But then there is 80-20 thinking. This one is insight-driven, qualitative, and honestly, a bit fuzzy. It's basically the mental habit of constantly asking yourself, what are the hidden, powerful causes here, without needing to build out a complex spreadsheet just to make a fast, intuitive judgment.
You know, the core secret of successful entrepreneurs down the ages is actually incredibly simple. Shift economic resources out of an area of lower productivity and into an area of higher productivity. That is the whole shebang when it comes to 80-20 thinking. You absolutely must stop doing the 80% of tasks that yield very little and deliberately multiply the time you spend on the hyper-productive 20%. Let's look at how drastically this revolutionized some specific areas we found in our source material. Take studying. 80% of an exam's value actually comes from just 20% of the subject knowledge. Focus there, and you succeed with way less effort. In consulting, 80% of profits come from long-term, large clients, so smart consultants stop chasing endless small leads. And in investing, 80% of your long-term portfolio growth will come from fewer than 20% of your investments. Find that vital few, put your eggs in that basket, and watch it like a hawk.
To wrap up our narrative today, I want to connect this 80-20 principle to the idea of just flat-out refusing to accept the wasteful status quo of the world. The playwright George Bernard Shaw brilliantly noted, "The reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable one persists in trying to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man." For sure, you have to be a little unreasonable. Don't just accept that 80% of your effort is going to waste. So, I'll leave you with this final provocative thought to take away from today's explainer. Take a hard look at your own daily routine, your work, and your relationships. What is the 20% of your life that is driving 80% of your happiness? Find it, multiply it, and let go of the trivial many. Thanks so much for joining me, and I'll see you on the next explainer.